It's Tuesday, August 18th, 2015, and you're listening to the Armchair Atheism podcast. I'm your host, Taylor Carr, and for this episode, naturalism is our topic of conversation. What does a naturalist believe? Are all naturalists strict scientific reductionists? Can there be room for meaning and morality in the naturalistic worldview, or even for religion? I pose some of these questions and more to philosopher John Shook in this episode of Armchair Atheism. John Shook is Research Associate in Philosophy and Instructor in Science Education for the University at Buffalo. He holds a Ph.D. in Philosophy from the University at Buffalo, served as Professor of Philosophy at Oklahoma State University from 2000 to 2006, has worked for several secular and humanist organizations, including the Center for Inquiry and the American Humanist Association, and he is the author and editor of numerous books such as The God Debates, published in 2010 by Wiley Blackwell. Dr. Shook, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me on, Taylor.
No problem. So first of all, I guess it would be a good place of starting to discuss what got you interested in philosophy, and specifically the philosophy of religion, which you seem to write about a lot in many of your works.
Oh, well, in high school I always seemed to be reading intellectual history and philosophy. I had parents with amateur interests that were very broad, and eventually I gravitated towards philosophy in college. It wasn't my first major, but it was my last, and I did my dissertation on the philosophy of pragmatism. The nice thing about pragmatism is you get to stick your nose into every other discipline's business. Pragmatism does everything from philosophy of language and mind and epistemology right on through aesthetics and philosophy of culture. So I suppose I've always been looking for the broadest possible exercise of my intellect.
Were you religious yourself when you started out studying any of these subjects?
No, never been religious. My parents never attempted to really talk about religion in the home. My mother was non-religious, and as I got a little older, I found out she happily called herself an atheist, although she wasn't publicly an atheist. My dad was sort of mildly religious. He liked taking us to church, and I could tell that people in church were going on and on about this God thing, but I never believed. I suppose I was an agnostic from the cradle and never found a good reason to leave that opinion.
Well, I'm sure that there are many people who it sounds like would probably identify with that path. So anybody who's read a little bit about naturalism is probably aware that it's usually separated into two primary categories, methodological and metaphysical naturalism. So to begin our discussion of what is naturalism for this episode, can you elaborate on the distinction between these two categories and the differences involved in them? Are there areas of overlap?
That's a good question, and you'll find me opinionated on the subject of naturalism. I don't like the distinction. I know why people make the distinction that you described, but it is extremely unhelpful, and it's not possible to clarify it. So instead, with your permission, I'll tell you the actual difference between two important kinds of naturalism, and I think people will find it much more useful. So there's a difference between what might be called sort of ordinary scientific naturalism, and that's simply the view that of all of the ways of understanding the world around us, science is the most reliable and in the long run the one to trust, which means that if you want to understand what actually is going on out there, and if you want some theories, some hypotheses about why, you're not going to do better than science. Now, that view, of course, does not preclude the obvious way that science itself changes, modifies, grows, and improves over time. So when you're a scientific naturalist, you have no problem. Indeed, you are happily in agreement that what is considered real today will not be considered as real tomorrow. And that's okay. That means science is making progress. There is another kind of naturalism. I'm not sure what to call it, but it's definitely excessively philosophical. I suppose you can call it metaphysical, though naturalism by definition is allergic to metaphysics as traditionally done both east and west. But if you have to call it metaphysical, I suppose. But it's certainly excessively philosophical. And what I mean is it gets way too interested in a dumb question. And the dumb question is this: how can we know that science is doing a really good job at representing reality? That's a metaphysical question if there ever was one.
Yeah.
Scientific naturalists deny that very question has any intelligibility. So that's a pretty severe distinction. It isn't possible to figure out how it is that, quote, science gets nature more or less right, because in order to do so, you'd have to have some standard of reality other than science in the first place. Now, if you actually had an outstanding knowledge of reality, a form of knowing quite independent from science that did better than science at knowing what reality was, so you could adopt that viewpoint and then criticize science for not doing as well, I suppose. If there existed such a thing, then you could, I suppose, do that sort of metaphysical naturalism. But of course, that's exactly what scientific naturalism denies. The point of scientific naturalism is that science itself reveals, as best as we can know, what nature's doing, and if there was a better way of knowing, science would adopt that way of knowing. Because science, as I said, grows and it's experimental and it's open to experience. So those are the two big distinctions that I see going on. For example, if a philosopher said that some perfected science infinitely far into the future gets reality right, and our poor little immature science of today doesn't do so well, that's metaphysical in a way that genuine scientific naturalism would take no interest in, precisely because it's useless. It does no work. We have no idea what any sort of infinitely perfected science would say, so to even contemplate such matters is just a pointless exercise. So at any rate, in my writing, I advocate naturalism, and what I mean by that is scientific naturalism. There are plenty of ways to get to know the world. Science is one of them, and science does a great job. And so far, we haven't invented anything better.
You know, I have to say, a lot of times when I do come across that distinction between methodological and metaphysical naturalism, it seems like, I guess, there's this reluctance on the part of some of the people who are involved in scientific discoveries and scientific experiments who happen to be religious to associate themselves with the metaphysical side of naturalism. So I guess I could understand that there's, for them it seems almost as if they're willing to say, look, I'll buy into this, you know, I guess you could say prudentially, or, you know, to do my job, but as far as the metaphysical end of it, you know, I still believe in God and religion and all this other stuff.
Oh, well, sure, that's the fun of philosophy of religion. You can say something like, well, science does great and science gets us so far, but there's so much more. Well, okay, so the burden of proof is on the somebody who's got the so much more. And we hear them out and see if there are good reasons behind believing in things that science has been unable to confirm.
Yeah, so this kind of segues pretty nicely into another thing that I hear a lot of times actually by religious apologists, and that's that naturalism unfairly rules out things like miracles from the get-go, or has a bias against, I guess you could say, supernaturalism or non-naturalisms. Why is this type of naturalism useful and important to science, though?
Well, I've already answered your question. It isn't. useful and important to science. So I agree with the religious apologists that, oh, sorry, you were asking about methodological naturalism, not metaphysical naturalism, didn't you? You said it's argued by religious apologists that methodological naturalism, oh, I misheard you. Well,
yes, my
I
mistake.
do take the position that methodological naturalism, or as I just call it, plain ordinary scientific naturalism, rules it out. Well, the problem is, of course, is that religious apologists don't like the rules that science plays by. Why? Well, because they don't think that scientific knowledge is particularly valid for the things that they want to talk about, like supernatural goings-ons and miracles and so forth. So for them to complain that methodological naturalism rules out miracles is just for them to repeat themselves. They're just stuttering. What they're just simply saying is, oh, science can't confirm God. Well, this is not a surprise to anybody, least of all to them. That's why they complain in the way they do. The way to impress people that miracles are actually happening is to objectively confirm the existence of miracles. There are rules to objectivity, just plain, ordinary, common sense objectivity. Miracles can't even pass that very low-level test, much less any sort of testing that would happen under controlled laboratory conditions. So I think that religious apologists had better first pass common sense tests of objective evidence for the existence of miracles. Hasn't happened. So you don't even really need to drag science into it. And furthermore, there's also a sort of semantic argument going on, which means you're just arguing over words. Suppose you simply define miracle in advance, as many religious apologists do. You simply define miracle in advance as something that could not possibly be predicted or explained by science. And poof, you get your obvious result. Science won't be in the business of considering miracles. But then, of course, it's fraudulent to then whine and moan about science's unfairness when you yourself have predefined miracle outside the boundary of science.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Some of the apologists I've actually seen make this objection that it rules out things like miracles have in their own work defined miracles as, irregularities in nature and stuff like that, things that science can't really get a grasp on. And then they just turn around and say that, oh, but you're biased against miracles by having this scientific method, which is a little bit backwards, it would seem like, from what they argue.
These are rhetorical and polemical games.
Yeah.
And religious apologists play them, not because they're trying to impress us science-minded folks, but because they're playing to a home audience. They're playing to their base. They've already convinced their base that science is incompetent to deal with religious matters. So science's inability to confirm miracles, of course, just proves their point, and they enjoy repeating it.
Well, then, moving on to metaphysical naturalism, or I believe you're calling it scientific naturalism. It's been described in a number of ways, both by critics and proponents, which seems to suggest that there are variations of it. So what would you say are some of these varieties of naturalism?
Oh, well, I've written a paper on the subject. It's published in The Pluralist. Go online. It's actually called Varieties of American Naturalism. Actually, it has a longer, more complicated title, but if you Google me, you'll find it. So there are three main types that have been dominant in 20th century and into the 21st century discussions of naturalism. One is very familiar. It's the so-called reductive naturalism. And the way to be a reductive naturalist is you select out just a few of the sciences. You might pick the social sciences. That was popular for a time. In the second half of the 20th century, it was the so-called hard sciences or physical sciences, and that continues a sort of dominance. So the way to be a reductive naturalist is, you say, that unless some sort of entity is theorized by one of the hard sciences, well, what are the hard sciences? So you're looking at your life sciences, biology, chemistry, onto physics, and other areas that rely on physics, such as subatomic physics and cosmology and so forth. Unless an entity is real according to those sciences, it really isn't real, or it's somehow just derivatively real. So that's reduction. A middle course is to say, no, all of the sciences legitimately discover what reality is doing, and you can't really play favorites like that. If you get into disagreements, well, you just sort of have to empirically work it out. There's no quick fix by prioritizing one science over the other. And then there's a third position that says, well, science does a great job, but pragmatically speaking, it is one among many ways of understanding what nature is doing. The best, perhaps, but just one. Don't expect everything to answer to the sciences, although the sciences had better not rule it out. But there's plenty of things like aesthetic experiences, spiritual experiences, emotional experiences, and so forth and so on, that are just as revealing of our relationship with nature as science. So those are the three main positions, and of the three, my pragmatism leans towards the third, but good cases could be made for the other two.
So I guess also at this point it would be useful to clarify on what exactly we're meaning, if it changes in any of these different naturalisms, what exactly is meant by the term nature. Is this you've referred to what's demonstrable through the scientific method, what might come through experience? Is it generally things like that?
Well, the broadest definition of naturalism that I'm aware of, and it's the one that critics attack, is that that nature is what experience, reason, and science working together tell us is going on around us in the widest possible sense. And the three of them have to work together. If you only use experience, you get a kind of very phenomenalistic, possibly subjectivistic worldview, which really isn't a kind of naturalism. If you only use reason, you don't really get various sorts of rationalistic metaphysical systems, like Leibniz, Plato, for example, might head in that direction. Science alone, you don't really want to use science alone. The reason is because science, of course, needs evidence and it needs reason. So you would only contradict yourself if you try to rule out experience and reason. So I claim that you have to have all three of them working together. And whatever turns out to be accessible through experience, reason, and science working together will count as nature. And anything that says, no, that those three things are nice, but they're not enough, we have some fourth way of accessing reality, well, that would be a philosophy or a theology that departs from naturalism, because they're claiming that nature isn't enough. There's something beyond nature as well.
One of the, I guess I'd say fairly common and also maybe simplistic definitions of naturalism that I sometimes hear is that it's basically just supernatural entities don't exist. And it sounds like what you're talking about can kind of...
Yeah, the problem is, of course, that's a circular definition, because in order to define the supernatural, you already need a working conception of the natural. So the prior work is, what do you mean by natural? And you did a good job holding me to that work.
So many of the religious critiques of naturalism do seem, I've noticed, to focus on a very reductive kind of physicalism or materialism. How important and relevant would you say the differences are between these varieties of naturalism that we've discussed? And is there any sense in which it could be legitimate to say, oh, it's all just the same thing?
Well, it isn't the same thing. I put a lot of effort into varieties of naturalism. The non-reductive varieties have a far easier time dealing with religious objections that important things are getting left out. It's the reductivists, of course, that have all the fun. They have all the fun first claiming that reality is nothing but a very narrow theoretical range of entities approved of by their hand-selected sciences. And second of all, then they have the fun of saying, and nothing else is real, and then explaining and then explaining what's really going on. But I mean, that's the fun of it. And if you're a reductive naturalist, it keeps you terribly busy, and you're not impressed by people who say, oh, well, but there's these experiences of the transcendently sublime, and there's these mystical experiences of blah, 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 right? When you're a reductivist, what you do is you busily set to work, you take one of your hand-picked narrow sciences, and you investigate, and you say, well, these experiences are nothing but, and then there's a story, right? They're nothing but brain waves, or they're nothing but, whatever is the story. The other kinds of naturalisms do think that the brain is involved with most everything we experience. In fact, kind of by definition, it has to be involved in one way or another with everything we're capable of experiencing. But the brain by itself isn't the whole story, because, of course, the brain evolved in order to deal with things going on around it. So you can't leave the other stuff out of account. And it's perfectly obvious, at least to me, that the brain is very interested in all sorts of mind-expanding and even mind-blowing experiences. The experiences are quite real, and it's not necessary, however, to postulate that they have nothing to do with us being natural organisms with natural brains. Right? It's a whole lot more is going on. We are social creatures, and cultured creatures. Our brains work together. There are no such things as lone brains cogitating their lonely thoughts. We are not Cartesian machines. So I think that non-reductive naturalists can far more easily explain how we are moral creatures, we're aesthetic creatures, we're cultural creatures, and we create extraordinary experiences for ourselves.
So what are some of the arguments for it sounds like you could make arguments for all these versions of naturalism or for individual ones. Do some arguments work better with certain varieties than they do with others?
Well, each one has to take care of its own turf. I work hard at my kind of pragmatic naturalism, that third kind, the most expansive kind, and I leave others to their work. There are kinds of naturalisms that seem to me a little just rigged and ad hoc. I think reductivists get themselves into those sorts of problems when they try to explain away things rather than actually explaining them, like meaning and value and important experiences to us. Another kind of naturalism I don't have anything to do with, but I understand the desperation behind it, is a sort of Platonic naturalism. Naturalists have traditionally had to worry about what makes mathematical and logical truths true, and if you think that that's a valid question to pursue in the first place, which I don't, but if you do, then you're looking for truth makers, you're looking for some sort of reality, and you end up in Platonism. And Platonism is the sort of thing that could easily be construed as very transcendental and idealistic and non-natural, or you could just turn around and say, well, I guess things like squares and Pythagorean theorem are just more nature. Yeah, I don't know. The Pythagorean theorem doesn't seem much like nature to me. So at any rate, but these are interesting and important debates that happen among naturalists.
Do you think that any of the, I guess you could call them evidential arguments, like, for example, from the way that our brains, that it affects consciousness, basically, when there's physical trauma to the brain, do you think things like that can be used to argue for naturalism? Like, would they be better for reductive naturalism than they would for example, the pragmatic naturalism?
Yeah, I see where you're going. It makes the job of the reductivist easier, but it's suspiciously too easy for me. I guess I'll take a swipe at reductionism again. I mean, as far as we can tell, our capacity to experience depends on, among other things, having a functioning brain. But I mean, what that means is that having a functioning brain is entirely neutral to the question of whether or not what we're experiencing really exists. If I doubt that there is a God, but a mystic is telling me, oh, well, look, I'm having God experiences and my brain is lighting up according to this fMRI scan of my brain, I'm like, yeah, it doesn't prove anything either way. I mean, it doesn't prove that God doesn't exist. It doesn't prove that God does exist. It explains why you're having those peculiar experiences and I'm not. But other than that, it's impossible to tell whether the brain is internally generating it or it's some sort of antenna detecting a real God. It's going to require more work than just that.
So if you were trying to defend pragmatic naturalism to somebody who didn't, I guess, accept some of its views, what would some of the work that you would be doing on that look like?
Oh, well, goodness, there's an entire industry.
You've written entire books on it, too.
Oh, yes. I have books out.
It's a big question.
Easy to find. So the advantages are, number one, you don't have to play the reductivist games. They are tiresome, and many people are looking for an alternative. Second of all, there is so much about us that ensures that you have to take human beings seriously as socialized and cultured creatures. That is to say, we're smart together. And we've been doing this for an exceedingly long time, and our species inherited most of these capacities from earlier hominid ancestors. So what this means is you're going to have to tell a very long story about how human beings came to have the marvelous capacities for things like morality and culture that we do. And just peering around inside the brain at what neurons are doing isn't going to tell that story. It just isn't. For example, you're leaving out evolution for one, and I don't think that any non-evolutionary account of what the brain is doing is going to work at all, especially not for a self-proclaimed naturalist. And furthermore, so much of what we do depends on culture. For example, religion is almost an entirely cultural thing that we do. No lone brain is religious by itself any more than a lone brain could use language by itself in isolation. So what you need to do is you need to be very generous towards all the kinds of rich experiences that human beings are capable of having together. Don't worry about whether it'll all reduce to what neurons are doing. Yes, neurons are doing what they're supposed to be doing, but they're doing it in much larger holistic complexes. So large, in fact, that they, not surprisingly, include much of the natural world around us. You simply can't leave the environment out of account.
So some theologians, such as I know Carl Peters and Philip Hefner, both who are former editors of the Zygon Journal of Science and Religion, have defended what's been called religious naturalism. And actually in your book, The God Debates, you reference Jerome, I can't remember his last name now, Jerome Stone.
Yeah.
Do you think it's possible for a religious believer to be a naturalist?
It all depends on what that believer means by being religious. The point of distinguishing naturalism from supernaturalism is, well, if you're a believer in the supernatural, you can't pass the naturalist test, so that would rule out a certain kind of religious naturalist. But of course, we can distinguish between being religious and adhering to a religion. This is a distinction that actually goes back to my pragmatists. It was William James and John Dewey who made a big deal out of this, and it's been often repeated ever since. It's an important distinction. What it points to is the fact that you, on the one hand, have institutionalized social structures and entities that we might call a religion, with its creeds and its doctrines and its dogmas and its theology backing all of that up, and right? So if you're a believer in that, you sort of have to take the whole thing lock, stock, and barrel. But on the other hand, uh, religions originally come from, of course, the experiences that individuals have together through ritual and practices and these sorts of things. So the religious could just simply refer to those emotional and aesthetic communal experiences, utterly irrespective of whether or not anybody can write down in a creed or a holy scripture what exactly they think is going on. You just do it. Joseph Campbell tells an amusing story of a question put to a Shinto priest after observing the Shinto rituals and the dancing and the performances and so forth and so on. The poor Shinto priest was confronted by a Westerner saying, "Well, this is all terribly lovely, but I don't get your theology." And the Shinto priest, according to Joseph Campbell, simply replied, "I don't think we have a theology. Sorry, we dance." Right? That's where the religious exists, and it's perfectly real in its own right. So if you are enjoying being religious, you're not thinking about the supernatural. You're not thinking about the natural. What are you thinking about? Enjoying the performance and the rich experiences you get out of it. So if you're in it for the experience, of course, and you feel comfortable calling it religious or spiritual or whatever other label you want to put on it, labels kind of get irrelevant. You can just simply enjoy it being a natural person living on the natural earth.
So I could foresee that there are probably some religious believers, maybe even some Christians out there who would say, okay, if we're going with nature as being what's established through experience, reason, and science, some of them undoubtedly believe that their religious beliefs are established through those things. And I guess some of them would reject the term naturalism, though, because they think of it in the reductive version.
Sure.
But how would you respond to somebody who still said that, okay, I'm a religious naturalist in the sense that I believe that experience, reason, and science do establish the claims, I guess I'd say the ontological claims of, my belief in God or something of that sort?
I'd have to look at the argument. I mean, I wrote a whole book knocking
that
down
would be where it comes
arguments.
down to the arguments over theology and atheology and stuff then.
Yeah, I'd have to look at the specific arguments. I don't think there are sufficiently reasonable arguments to make the leap from experience, reason, and nature, science, working together, towards anything that religion, not the religious, that religion claims, and that's why I'm properly classified as a skeptic in religion. I'm not a skeptic towards religious experiences. I'm quite confident religious experiences happen all the time. I mean, maybe I've had one. I don't know if I'd call it religious, but nevertheless, I'm human, no less than anyone. Yeah. So the experiences are real. The problem comes in selecting the right worldview framework in order to explain what's really going on. But of course, here, reason is sort of given a nod and then sort of set aside. What really decides these matters is whether you really want or need to believe that something more than nature is going on. And this sends a person in the direction of religion if they need, for example, some reassurance that something of them will survive their death, or they need some sort of reassurance that the values they prize will somehow be guaranteed for the life of the universe, so on and so forth, whatever it is, then they're going to be tempted to believe in a religion. But this has to do, of course, with personal temperament and what a person needs from life. It's perfectly understandable. I don't go there myself, but one can understand why people do that.
Aside from naturalism, another common term to hear embraced by those of us in the atheist community is humanism.
Sure.
What would you say distinguishes naturalism from humanism, and how might accepting one possibly lead to the other?
Well, humanism handles those normative things that I was just referring to. What do I do with these extraordinary experiences? How do I handle these deep-seated needs and wants? How do I live harmoniously with other people around me who probably want many of the same basic things, right? How do we meet the basic needs that human beings ought to have? Humanism answers those questions without resorting to religion. So, for example, it may resort to religious or spiritual experiences. So there are flavors of religious humanism, and it sounds almost exactly like religious naturalism. There's not much more than a semantic difference between the two. And these religious humanisms and religious naturalisms have a great deal to say normatively about how we human beings ought to live our lives. In essence, they head in the direction of ethics and perhaps even as far as politics. So humanists are interested in how to lead naturally excellent lives with each other. And of course, here we're just talking about philosophical ethics, and humanism can get pretty philosophical. But plain ordinary humanism that anybody could understand asks people, look, try to be moral. try to live together in peace. Try to respect each other's rights. There's a sort of do unto others ethos. And that's because humanism really doesn't try to reinvent or somehow spin out of pure reason normative values or ways that we ought to live. There's no need to do that. We're human beings. We are encultured and social critters, and we were raised with a morality, all of us. So fortunately, there's no need to reinvent it. What there is a need, of course, to disentangle it from religion and to try to make it as potent and as effective as possible in our human world. And that's where humanism then hands matters off to politics. Humanism almost invariably approves of democracy. So democracy is the political realization of living together under the rule of law that respects things like human rights and human dignity.
Well, kind of going off the different varieties of naturalism that we discussed earlier, I can foresee we've already kind of basically given some stuff to reductive naturalism multiple times now. But how would the other kinds of naturalism, I guess the non-reductive kind as well as the pragmatic kind that you're a fan of, still find space for mystery, meaning, and morality? Because I could foresee somebody saying, okay, well, humanism's all well and good, but it kind of starts from premises that may or may not coincide well with the type of naturalism that you hold to.
Sure. So let's start with, let's beat on reductive naturalism. When you're a reductive naturalist, life is easy. If there are experiences about alleged things that don't fit into the approved physicalist worldview, you either resort to some sort of massive error theory, or you simply claim that those experiences are being misdescribed. You would say something like, well, if you think you're knowledgeable about moral values, you're just suffering from an illusion. Number one, there are no such things as moral values. And number two, if you think you know anything about them, since you can't know about things that are not real, you're simply delusional. You are taking as real something that is not real. It's a stubborn illusion, but an illusion nonetheless. And their advice is get over it. Quit thinking that you're experiencing these things. Find some other way to talk about reality. That's the harsh but short version. The middle kind, and folks are probably trying to struggle with the middle kind. The middle kind acknowledges all of the sciences, but only the sciences. So that sort of pro-science naturalism, generous science, we might say, would put probably the social sciences to work on questions of meaning, value, enriching experiences, spiritual experiences, perhaps. And in fact, social psychology and anthropology, working together with the cognitive sciences, have done extraordinary work illuminating why it is that human beings are so susceptible to the kinds of experiences that religions make such a big deal out of. We're meant to be artistic. We're meant to have these powerful attachments and affections, and we're supposed to be deeply moved. It's okay. It's very human. It's part of what we are, and whatever you may want to say about the ultimate value of it, it certainly is going on, and you have to take it very seriously. You just can't dismiss it as unreal or as something you're not really supposed to be having. So those, I suppose, would be the main differences.
So to kind of cap things off, since pragmatism is a major area of your work and research, how would you go about making the argument that, because I know pragmatism has a lot to do with the concept of works, that something works. How would you go about arguing for a pragmatic, naturalistic view of meaning or morality in life, on the idea that it works?
Sure. So pragmatic naturalism just makes sure that it takes all of the breadth of human experience most seriously. It doesn't have to respect the irrational, because this is still a naturalism. Reason must be respected. And it doesn't have to quite reduce down to what science only says, right? That's our reductivists. It expects the three of them to work together. So what this means is it gives pragmatic naturalism the most explanatory breadth, conveniently, for naturalism. Us pragmatic naturalists find that because we have the most generous view of what human beings can experience, do experience, and frankly should experience, we can accommodate so much more of what religion claims for itself, but we can find it easily enough within the breadth of nature. We're not so fast to have to resort to God. This defuses almost every theological argument for the existence of something transcendent or supernatural. A typical argument, for example, goes, well, if you're a naturalist, you've got no explanation for why we should be moral. In fact, we shouldn't be moral, blah, 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 blah. But we really should be moral, so therefore God. What? Slow down. Wait, what? A little too fast. So pragmatic naturalism has a much more generous view of why anthropologically and culturally we ought to be engaged in morality, and we don't need God.
So what are some of the things that you have coming up in the future? Are you in the process of writing another book, or do you have some debates or anything like that?
Oh, us philosophers always have about 6 books, 2/3 written. It's an occupational hazard. Sure, I've got some stuff on the pipeline. Keep an eye on what we're working hard at under the label of neuropragmatism. It's supposed to kind of sound reductionist, but then we pull the rug out. It's actually not reductionist. It's very pragmatic. So neuropragmatism is a convenient cover word for a wide constellation of people knowledgeable about anthropology, biology, cognitive science, even neuroscience. And we are discovering that much of what pragmatism has always said about human experience, learning, intelligence, knowledge, science, is being busily confirmed by the sciences themselves. This isn't a big shock. The original pragmatists suspected it. That's why there were pragmatists. But it's nice to see that the 21st century isn't going to diminish their expectations. Another thing that I'm working very hard on is something called atheology, A-T-H-E-O-L-O-G-Y, the sort of counterpart to theology. I've published several papers, and there's more in the pipeline, about atheology, which is simply the attempt to understand atheism, give the very best arguments in favor of atheism, and to try to keep the theologians honest. It's not openly pragmatist, but anybody who sort of reads between the lines can tell that there is a fair amount of inspiration there.
So if people would like to find out more about you and some of your work, where can they do that at?
Academia.com.org. I don't know, what is it? Academia.something.com perhaps. I have a page there. I'm also on LinkedIn, and you can just Google me. I'm real easy to find. Fortunately, there aren't too many other John Shooks out there. If you run into a guy who does business consulting or an evangelical minister, yeah, my name is shared by those. But they're not me. I'm the guy into philosophy.
And you also run, are you the webmaster for naturalisms.org too?
I have, Naturalisms. Some other guy has got naturalism.org. I've got a few things up at naturalisms.org. I also run the Pragmatism Library at pragmatism.org. People can find out a lot more about pragmatism there. And if they're interested in keeping up with the latest in education on secular matters, humanism, and so forth, they can visit secularactivism.org. I also run that organization.
Well, I have to say all of those have been really good resources for me, so I encourage everybody listening to go check those out. John, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's really been delightful, and good luck with the terrific podcast.
Oh, thank you. Take care. I'd like to thank Dr. Shook for coming on the show. If you'd like to find out more about him or purchase any of his books, links are available in the description for this episode at godlesshaven.com. At godlesshaven.com, you can also find out more about the show, more about myself, and plenty of additional content. Music in the show is my own work. Thank you for listening, and please join me again in the not-too-distant future for another episode of Armchair Atheism.